Modern homages to classic video games often have a fine line to walk. With too many current-day conveniences, the game in question might not capture the retro flavor that it's trying to emulate, while being uncompromisingly old school can leave a game feeling dated or frustrating to play. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2, like its predecessor, inhabits that sweet spot between faithful emulation and modern evolution, providing even more classic Castlevania-style action with modern flair and approachability. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 takes place after the events of the first game, and rejoins the demon hunter Zangetsu following the reappearance of a powerful demon stronghold. In short, there are monsters that need to be killed, and it's up to you to kill them. The plot is, on the surface, very straightforward, but it serves as a decent enough vehicle for gameplay while also expanding on the world of Bloodstained. In particular, I really like the new characters that Zangetsu teams up with, and their interactions, while limited, do manage to flesh out their individual roles within the world. Except Hachi, but he's a Welsh corgi in a mech that looks like a steam engine, and let's face it, that's all the explanation you'll ever need for him. Beyond expanding on its setting, Curse of the Moon 2's characters also have surprisingly striking designs, given the limitations of the game's 8-bit art style. Obviously, the larger bosses and monsters are far more detailed, but all things considered, I genuinely think that the playable characters are some of the coolest 8-bit sprite art I've seen in some time. It also helps that they each make use of more pale color schemes that pop nicely against the usually darker environments. The environments in question are all varied and colorful despite being less bright than the character and monster sprites on the whole. With that said, I think my favorite aspect of Curse of the Moon 2's visuals were the occasional background animation flourishes. These little moments aren't super common, but when they happen it adds so much to the game's horror atmosphere, usually foreshadowing the appearance of something big and truly awful. Curse of the Moon 2's soundtrack also helps to push that spooky vibe with its wailing, reverberating retro soundtrack. It may not be a true 8-bit soundtrack, strictly speaking, but it manages to evoke the style of the old NES Castlevanias, and the lack of technical limitations result in a number of groovy, infectious tracks to kill monsters to, which is really what I'm here for as an old-school Castlevania fan. To that point, the killing of monsters is a fun and familiar experience, though to say that it's exactly the same as the first Curse of the Moon would be doing the game a disservice. Like its predecessor, Curse of the Moon 2 looks to deliver a Castlevania-style action platforming experience, with deliberate movement and attacks giving the game a slower yet still very satisfying feel. Despite this slower style, inputs feel tight and responsive, and at its base, Curse of the Moon 2 just feels really good to play. And that satisfying game feel extends to each of the game's playable roster, whose new additions are easily the big selling point of this sequel. Much like the previous game, Curse of the Moon 2 features 3 supporting characters that join Zangetsu on his journey, and they each change the way the game feels pretty significantly. Zangetsu serves as the solid base from which the other characters branch out, with a large health pool and a fast attack speed, making him an incredibly reliable character, but the 3 newcomers each have their own strengths to encourage you to use them. The church exorcist, Dominique, has a decent melee range and can attack enemies above or below her, but where she really shines is with her sub-weapons. Each character gets their own sub-weapons, which are typically good for attacking enemies at awkward angles, but Dominique has access to healing and resurrection magic on top of the usual fare, making her something of a support hero, which is pretty unique. Meanwhile, Robert, a former soldier and ally of Zangetsu, wields a musket which gives him the furthest non-magical range out of all the game's playable characters, but these attacks are low in damage. Sniping isn't the only reason to use Robert though. He's also the only character able to go prone and crawl, allowing him to avoid most projectiles, and his wall jump gives him access to areas that most characters can't reach without using magic sub-weapons. Finally, Hachi is a Welsh corgi in a mech suit, which should be more than enough reason for you to use him on its own. But if you need some kind of gameplay incentive, then I guess Hachi also has the most HP of the group, and is able to traverse areas that would be hazardous to other characters, such as floors covered in spikes, for instance. His ability to hover also makes the game's platforming sequences a little more forgiving, since every other character really commits to their jump arc in true Castlevania fashion. The mech does make him a massive target though, so if you're not careful, Hachi's health can drop pretty damn quickly. And unlike the other characters, he doesn't get any access to sub-weapons, which means his moveset is pretty limited. With characters that are so diverse and interesting, it's handy that the game lets you swap between them at will. This lets you try them out with relative safety and allows you to make use of specific characters when their abilities become relevant, before switching back to a character you're more comfortable with. For example, I rarely used Dominique in combat because her attacks were just a little too slow for my liking, but I'd often swap to her just to use her healing spells before swapping back to Zangetsu or Robert. Being able to swap between characters at will is one way that Curse of the Moon 2 tempers its retro difficulty, but that doesn't stop it simply letting you play as your favorite, or letting you swap out a character who's low on HP to try and stretch your lives further. These varied character abilities and your ability to change characters at the push of a button allows the game to present players with branching paths, and while the game is ultimately linear, there are multiple routes through each level which often include less hazardous shortcuts. With that said, none of this stops Curse of the Moon 2 from being an absolute bastard of a challenge when it wants to be. Enemies deal a significant amount of damage, their attack patterns can be really tricky to get used to, and on veteran difficulty, getting hit will knock you back, usually down a convenient pit. On top of all that, the game does feature a life system, which is the only part of the game that really feels dated. It's all extremely Castlevania, but if that's not appealing to you, the game, like its predecessor, offers a nice compromise in the form of casual mode. The biggest differences between both modes are the infinite lives and lack of knockback found in casual mode, which is refreshing once you've had your fill of the classic experience. But the best part is that Curse of the Moon 2 doesn't penalize you for switching difficulties. Not only that, you're able to change the difficulty up or down at any point, and if you really feel like you need the help, you can call in a buddy for some local co-op fun. If I were to make a suggestion, I would recommend playing through once on veteran before playing subsequent runs on casual, mostly because that first run through feels pretty fairly balanced. It's a tough time, don't get me wrong, but I never found it frustrating. Subsequent runs, however, experience a significant spike in difficulty, particularly with regards to the game's boss fights, which just feel like damage sponges. That's a shame too, because during the first run, Curse of the Moon 2's bosses are genuinely entertaining sequences that require decent reflexes and pattern recognition, whereas bosses after you complete episode 1 just feel like a slog. Now honestly, my biggest gripe with the game is that if you want to get Curse of the Moon 2's proper ending, you do have to finish the game multiple times with little variation, just like you had to in the first game. Sure, replaying these levels with different characters and taking new routes makes this a less repetitive experience overall, but there aren't many meaningful changes beyond an additional attack pattern during a boss fight. With all that said, it's hard to argue that playing through the game again isn't worthwhile, since you're able to unlock the supporting characters from the first Curse of the Moon, as well as a solo hero mode where each character can get their own ending. I think that makes for something like 11 endings in total, which is not something that I plan on achieving anytime soon, but if you want to squeeze every second of value out of this game as possible, then Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 has a decent amount to offer. It really is just more of the first game, but with some interesting new characters to justify slapping a 2 on the title, and you know what? I'm okay with that. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 is excellent. Though it doesn't make quite the same strong impression as the previous game, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 manages to deliver a fun and interesting follow-up thanks in large part to an expanded cast of playable characters. Otherwise, the game is more of what made the original great. More surprisingly detailed sprite art, more groovy, spooky tunes, more awesome boss encounters, and more classic Vania vibes. I highly recommend it to anyone with a love of retro-inspired games, fans of the old NES Castlevanias, and of course, fans of Curse of the Moon 1. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 is available on Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One, and PC.